Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, coming to you once again from my office. Just have a quick follow-up video and have a lot of stuff to show you on the computer, so we're going to do it from the office this time. And in this case, we're going to talk about the Z9 4.1 firmware update. Now, as you know, I had a look at the pre-production firmware before it was released. However, I did want to follow it up now that I have more time with the firmware, and we're actually going to talk about 4 different things. I want to touch briefly on some of the observations I made and how they compare to the current firmware versus the pre-production software that I had used. I want to talk about how this works against the Sony A1. I've had a lot of time in the field with both the Z9 and the A1 side by side. We're using the same lenses basically on them, the 200 to 600 on Sony, the 180 to 600 on the Nikon. So we're kind of doing an apples to apples comparison here as best we can. And I'm going to tell you which is the new king of bird AF. In addition, we're also going to talk about if you should use bird mode for everything, for mammals and birds, or if you should switch between animal and bird, depending on whether you're working with a mammal or a bird. So we're going to do all of that. And then I'm also going to show the Nikon Z9 shooters, and this is going to apply to the Z8 eventually when this comes out in the first half of 2024. I'm going to show you how to set your recall shooting function so you can switch between animal and bird with just the press of a button. So a lot of stuff kind of packed into this video. I'm going to try to be as brief as I can. So let's just jump right in. Okay, so let's start with a few quick differences between the pre-production software that I used, the firmware that I used, and the production software. Because one thing I noticed is that when you had a subject like this, a lot of times it would bounce between the head and the eye. And you can see that here as I scrub through this video. It's kind of bouncing around between the two of them. Not great, you know, but I've noticed that that seems to have lessened with the actual production software. So although it was a little bit of a concern to me in the first video, I'm not seeing that as much. I've also noticed it's easier to corral the AF point with the production software. You can just use something like wide small and put it on the bird's head. Here, I'll show you a quick for instance there. So if you do find it bouncing around a little bit, you can simply, let me scroll here, I have a wide small here. You can simply use something like wide small and it'll keep it from going down to the body as long as you keep it kind of up there. Now, if you go towards the body, it might jump to the body. That's not unusual. But if you keep the AF area towards the head, it does tend to stay on there. Now, I went too low there and you can see it went down to the body. And so basically, if you're having a hard time with it bouncing around and you want to make sure it just kind of stays on the head, your best bet, let me close that, your best bet is simply to make sure that you're using a small, like wide AF area and kind of keeping the system's attention just in that area. Because what's going to happen is one of two things. It's either going to see the head and the eye, and subject detection is going to take over, refine it, and focus on that head or eye. Or it's not going to see the head and eye if it doesn't identify it, and it'll just use the smaller wide AF area as it normally would, which is usually what you want anyhow. If you're just focusing on the head, you're probably going to get a sharp shot either way. What we don't want is it bouncing down to the body. So this is one way to restrict that if you happen to see it. Again, it doesn't seem to be as big a deal, but that's basically the only differences I noticed between the pre-production software and the production firmware, is that it seems like it's easier to corral it using a wide AF area, and it doesn't seem to bounce around quite as much. And all of that is great news, and it lets me say things like, this is the best bird detection system that I've ever used. And I can say that confidently now that I've used the production firmware and that I've been out a little bit. And yes, I know that's saying that's even better than the Sony A1, which is kind of this, you know, where the bar is set. But I think the Z9 has passed it. So let's talk about that next. So the first thing I want to talk about here with the Sony versus Nikon thing is that they are between 90 and 95% the same still. So it's not like Nikon's blowing Sony out of the water or anything like that. Most of the time, you're going to see zero difference between the two cameras if you're shooting basically the same setup side by side. It's only maybe a 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 chance where you're going to see something different with the Sony. And it happens under kind of a very specific circumstance. It seems like for the most part, when the cameras see the eye of the bird, once they're on the bird, they're both pretty close to equally sticky. Although I do have to say, in no circumstance anymore do I see a time where the A1 has actually been better than the Z9. What I've seen is the two of them are either neck and neck, or the Z9 is just a hair bit better. That's what I'm seeing now, based on shooting a wide variety of birds at this point. So anyhow, let me show you a couple examples, because there's one place where Sony kind of gets tripped up where Nikon does not. And that is when you're using something like maybe zone or the wide AF area in Sony. Now, wide AF in Sony is the same as auto AF in Nikon, so basically full screen coverage. And that's kind of how I was comparing these cameras. And zone is basically a smaller version of wide in Sony, or auto if you want to think of it that way. And what happens is sometimes Sony's going to pick up stuff in the foreground and get stuck on that and not see the bird. On the other hand, Nikon seems to be able to recognize that there's an out of focus bird in the frame and says, no, I don't think it wants this random spot that I'm focusing on. I think this guy probably wants this bird. And we were lucky enough to be able to record a couple of examples with the Atomos, which is very, very difficult with birds to do this. So let's take a quick look. I have some gulls here. We'll start with that. There's a better example here. This is the one I really want to show you here, because this is where the Sony's kind of messing up. So here we have it. I manually focused it, and then boom, comes right in. Does not hesitate, does not get stuck on the foreground. I want you to notice that it's not getting stuck on the foreground. Now, let's take a look at what happens when I use this same bird with the Sony doing the same kind of thing. And you can see it's not quite getting on the bird. Even right here, when it's right under the bird, it's not getting it. And yes, it was on bird AF. Now, with a little bit of help here, I could, yeah, you can see I double checked to make sure it was on bird AF, but you can see it's not quite getting on the bird. Now, when the bird is actually focused, I defocused it there, found it there that time. Nope, it didn't. And you can see the kind of struggle it's having here. Now, Nikon would find that bird instantly, where Sony's really struggling. That water is really throwing it off. Now, if I focus on the bird itself and then go in there, boom, you can see it gets it right there. So the bird had to be in very good focus for the Sony system to find it. Whereas with Nikon, it is just about instantaneous. Let me find that spot here again. It is just about instantaneous. Just watch. I'm going to defocus, boom, refocus. It just finds it every time. It does not get hung up on everything else here. It finds the bird each time. So that initial pickup is really where I'm seeing the difference between these two systems. And I realize that some Sony shooters, and I'm a Sony shooter too, guys. I have a horse in this race myself. But I realize some people say, well, what about using something like zone? Because that's usually what we do, especially for birds in flight. Zone's a very common strategy. But the thing is, zone is basically just a smaller version of auto. And if you're a Sony shooter and you've been using it for any amount of time, you know zone gets hung up in much the same way as what you just saw. Now, of course, we could go to something like, spot, medium, large, or small and get right on that bird with the Sony, and it would refine it to the eye. That works great. But when you're giving Sony the whole screen like that, it just goes, I don't know where to focus, which isn't great. But Nikon finds it immediately, which is really, really cool. Now, another place I see Sony get caught up is sometimes it'll, again, get something in the foreground. If it's kind of busy, it'll get on something that's not the bird. So let me show you another example. So here's this cardinal, and you can see what happened. It got stuck on these berries over here when I defocused. So sometimes it would get on the cardinal's eye when I would initially focus, but a lot of times that's what I saw. Now with the Nikon, and we did this multiple times also. I don't want you to think that this was just a one-off. We would basically play with both cameras and see if we were getting this kind of an effect or if there was a difference between them. And then I'd put the Atomos on and try to get it all recorded for you. So, but here, let's see. Here's the cardinal out of focus. And I want you to notice something here. Not only is a cardinal out of focus, it's out of frame. Watch what happens. And it goes boom. Just as it's getting in there, it's like there's a bird there and it found the eye when it was all the way at the top. And this is what we were seeing. It was instantly jumping to the bird every single time. It wasn't getting hung up on anything. So those initial pickups with the Nikon are definitely, in some cases, better than the Sony. Again, I want to emphasize 95% of the time, both cameras were the same. And once they got on the eye, both of them were pretty close as far as sticking to it. I do think the Nikon might be a hair bit stickier, but it's so close, I don't want to say that for sure. But definitely you can see the difference in those initial pickups there. As far as flight shots, same story. Once it got on the bird, it was really good. Both cameras stuck with it really well. And I don't know that there was a remarkable difference. I unfortunately did not have a lot of time to do flight shots. Where I live, there's just not a lot of flight opportunities. I was playing with the gulls, which are pretty easy targets. And for the most part, yeah, both cameras seem to do about equally well for those specific flight shots. But yeah, I'd say that Nikon really has made some progress here. However, keep in mind that Sony may update their firmware. In fact, I think there's a rumor out there that they're going to update the firmware on the A1, although I think there's always a rumor about that. So right now, Nikon has the slight edge. Next week or the week after or a month after, maybe Sony has the slight edge. But I think the takeaway here is both of them are excellent. So let's move on and talk about if you want to use bird for everything, including mammals, or if you should switch between them. Okay, so I loaded up some new examples, as you can see over here, and I want to talk about which mode to use for what subjects, because there's been a lot of talk about using bird mode, that bird mode is actually better than animal mode and things like that when you're dealing with mammals, and that's not what I have found at all. So my advice is, if you're shooting mammals, start with animal and not with bird. Bird can sometimes find a mammal, but animal seems to do it far, far more consistently. And we're going to show you some examples of that here soon. And in fact, I'm going to go as far as to say this. Animal mode is much better at finding birds than bird is at finding mammals. So let's take a look at some examples here, though, just to kind of drive this home and to also maybe explore why people think bird mode is actually working well with mammals. Because I think what's happening is there's a misunderstanding of how subject detection works. So we're going to start with my cat Patches here, or Princess in more formal circles. And as you can see, we are in bird mode here, and if I hit play, it's not going into subject detection mode at all. Now, here is where I think the problem comes in, though. Let's try to pause it here. Here's where I think the problem comes in, though. Okay, if you see all of these little dots, AF points on her face, this is not subject detection mode, because here's what I think is happening. People are in bird mode, and they say, look, the camera sees the mammal. That's not what's happening here at all. This is not subject detection at this point. Subject detection is a refinement of your current AF area, and it will always only be one AF point. It won't be multiples like this. What's happening here is auto just happened to find the cat. It doesn't have anything to do with subject detection. Subject detection is like an automatic refinement autofocus mode that kicks in and overrides your current one. So if you're in auto, like I am here, and it sees a subject, it will go down to one little AF point, and that's your current AF point. If it loses a subject, it goes back, it hands it back to auto and says, I don't know where, I don't see any subject, just do your thing. And then auto just tries to do its thing. And the same applies in 3D, although 3D generally is just a single AF point anyway, but when it's going in, if you don't see it changing size and kind of refining to that eye, or going larger and going to the body, then you're probably not actually in subject detection. It's just 3D kind of doing its thing. These AF modes work pretty well on their own. So anyhow, let me show you what subject detection actually looks like. We're going to go to animal mode here. Boom. Right there, you can see we have a single AF point lit up, and that's it. Now we have an option to go from eye to eye, but in bird mode, once again here, nothing. So here we are in auto. Go to animal mode, and boom, we have it right there on the eye. Just like that. That's subject detection taking over, and you can see the bird mode wasn't working at all. As a quick side note, I go over this kind of stuff in detail. I tell you everything you need to know about subject detection, AF area modes, all of that in my Z8 and Z9 setup guide. That chapter alone, I promise you, is worth the price of the book. Because in order to get the most from the AF systems in these cameras, you really do need to understand the nuances of each AF area mode, of subject detection, and how all that stuff works together in the field, and when to pick what for whatever subject you're dealing with. The book goes into detail about it. I hope you'll check it out. So I tried this on a variety of mammals. I've tried it a little bit in the woods and stuff, but I thought, why not go to the zoo? So I did a bunch of different mammals there. In some cases, it doesn't work at all in any mode. Elephants, giraffes, things like that. Subject detection is just not going to get you there. But, you know, for some other animals, I was able to test it, and I did get some of it on the Atomos. I would have had more, but it was raining, and I didn't want to ruin my Atomos. It's not waterproof. So I did what I could here, but I think I have some decent examples here for you. So let's start with this one. I have a dingo here, and I'm in bird mode for this right now, and you can see auto is just kind of all over the place there. It's not actually refining it down. Subject detection is not taking over at this point. Here's animal mode, and you can see it's right on his eye. It's sticking to it, no problem at all. Scroll over here. It's in bird mode, as you can see. Anytime it's in bird mode, you see all of these little squares, all these little AF points. It's just not seeing the dog at all. It's not seeing the dingo at all. As soon as I go into animal mode, there it is. Boom. It's right on the eye. You can see animal mode right on the eye. So again, bird mode is not finding this dingo's eye at all. It never found it once. Now, I know some people are like, well, what about a different AF mode? So here's wide, large. Same thing. And this is another good example of how subject detection works. If you notice, we have this secondary white box. It's only white right now because I wasn't actively focusing, but as soon as I focus, Boom, you can see right there, it's green. So what's happening is this is not engaged at the moment. It is corralling it to the watch area for the wide AF area, but this is your actual focus point. This is subject detection in action, and you can see we're in animal mode. Now, if I go to bird mode here, let's find out with bird mode. Here's bird mode. Watch what happens when I focus. If you notice, the entire thing lights up, but we don't have a secondary box. We don't have that subject detection box here. And so what's happening is this is just working as wide large right now. Subject detection is not engaged. It's focused on the animal, but subject detection is not engaged this time. It's just using it as a normal AF area. And of course, if we go back to animal, boom, it instantly finds it. So let's take a look at a couple other ones real quick. And here we go. This is a brown bear. And in bird mode, it's all over the place. Auto can't find it at all. I switch over to animal mode and it's relatively on the eye. Again, this is what I found over and over. I had one other one. I think it's this one here. Nope, sorry. Oh, here it is. It's the polar bear. And if we look here, we're in bird mode and it's all over. We're just in auto. Now, auto does a good job of kind of narrowing down where you want to be. So sometimes auto is fine. But again, this isn't subject detection here. This just happens. It just happens that auto is finding it. Watch what happens when I flip over to animal mode. Right there on the eye instantly, single AF point. It's refined it, it's on it, and watches it until it gets out of the frame there. And then jumps to the other eye. So again, I tried this on a variety of mammals. We've had some feedback on the BCG forums about this. This was a big topic over there. And pretty much everybody who tried it with their pets found the same thing. It seems that animal mode works fine with mammals, and bird mode is very, very hit and miss or doesn't work at all. So my recommendation is the same as it's been. If you're dealing with mammals, go to animal mode first. Now, there may be isolated times bird mode actually is better for mammals. I have not found that yet, but maybe there is. There have been some reputable sources that say it is, but I would start with animal mode for mammals. And if it's not working, try bird mode. You have nothing to lose. Give it a quick try and see if it works. But my advice is if you're going for mammals, use animal mode. If you're going for birds, use bird mode. And if you're not sure, if you're just walking through the woods, you don't know if you're finding a bird or a mammal, go to animal mode, because animal mode still does a decent job with birds. Not quite as good as bird mode does, but it still does a very good job with birds. So if I'm just walking through the woods, don't know what I'm going to see, I'm going to put it in animal mode. Now, let's talk about how to quickly switch between animal and bird mode using our recall shooting function. I'm going to show you how to do that right now. Okay, so here's how we're going to do this. The first thing you're going to have to decide is, what is your primary subject detection mode going to be, right? Are you mostly a bird shooter? Do you shoot mostly birds, or do you shoot mostly mammals? Or is it someplace in between? For me, I tend to shoot a little bit more birds than I do mammals, probably a lot more birds really than I do mammals. So I'm going to switch the Z9's subject detection mode over to bird, and then I will flip to animal mode if I happen to come across a mammal. So let's take a look at how that works. So what I'm going to do is I have it on the eye menu. So I just go into my eye menu, and then I go down to bird, give it a click, and there I go. I'm in bird mode. Now, if you don't happen to have your AF area mode / subject detection option on your eye menu, you can also do this through the regular menu. Just press the menu button, scroll all the way down to AF subject detection options, and then you can select bird or animal from that menu. Again, for me, it's birds, so I just went ahead and clicked that. So that's the first step. Now that's going to be what subject detection is in by default without you doing anything. So that's the first step. Next, we have to set our recall shooting functions so that when we press our selected button, that this goes from bird mode into animal mode, or vice versa if you're going the other way. So to do that, it's pretty easy. We go down to our custom setting menu, controls, and what we're looking for here is the custom controls shooting option. We're going to give that a click, and then we're going to select which button we want to put this on. Now for me, I'm just using the sub-selector center, that's the joystick. We're going to click the selected button. Now I happen to be already at recall shooting functions, and I'm going to use the hold option so I don't have to keep pressing the button. I just press it once and I can release the joystick and it's going to stick to a point. We'll talk about that too. Now this is about midway down the list, so you might come in and you might be all the way up here, and you're going to have to scroll down to find your recall shooting functions option here. Give that a click, and you're going to come to a list. My suggestion for this setup is to make sure all of these boxes are unchecked. So if you happen to have like shooting mode checked, just click it, the OK button, and it'll uncheck it, or you can tap it with your finger if you have tap functions enabled. And make sure all of these are unchecked and go all the way down, just double checking that they're all unchecked. And we want to go to AF subject detection options. And as you can see, I have animal set here. So I'm going to make sure that's checked, and I'm going to press the right side of my multi-selector to go into the submenu, and that allows me to select animal, birds, or whatever. Again, for me, it's going to be animal. For you, it might be birds. Depends on what you set the other value to. So I'm going to press animal, and then you're going to press the menu button to lock it in. If you just hit OK, it's not going to do anything. If you just go back, it's not going to do anything. Hit the menu button to lock that in. So then we have our settings locked in. And that's pretty much the setup. Now to use, I'm just going to press the shutter release there to go back into shooting mode. All I'm going to do, if you watch up at the top where the little bird is, I'm going to press in on my joystick, and it goes to animal mode, and I press in again, and it goes out. Now if you notice, when I'm in animal mode, we have the little camera there on the left indicating that recall shooting functions are active. Now, the problem here is that there's a multitude of things that you can do to your camera that will inadvertently kick you out of recall shooting hold. So right now, it's there. I can change my shutter speed. I can change my f-stop. I can even change my ISO. It doesn't matter. I'll stay in animal mode because recall shooting functions is still active. But if I say want to change exposure compensation, so I press exposure compensation, and if you'll notice, just pressing the button, recall shooting shut off. If you notice, the bird is back up there at the top, not the animal. So if I'm shooting something in animal mode and I go to change my exposure compensation, it's going to knock me out. There's a couple other things that can do this too. So let's go back in here. If we change our AF area, or even threaten to change our AF area. So I'm just going to press the focus mode button to change the AF area, and you can see, boom, we're back to bird mode. So I'm going to press my joystick again to enable it. Now, a couple other things that can mess you up here. If you shut your camera off, it's going to knock you out of recall shooting mode. Or even if you go into the I menu, for instance. I'm just going to jump in here, press the I button. I'm going to press the I button again, and watch. It's going to be back to bird. There you go. So just beware of that. If you make any camera adjustments, always check to make sure you're still in the proper mode, especially if you're using recall shooting. If you press that joystick in, any changes you make besides shutter speed, f-stop, and ISO, just double check. You might have to press the button again to get back into it. So just fair warning. But yeah, that should do it. All right, so there you have it. Thanks so much for watching. Make sure you check out that Z8 and Z9 setup guide just to make sure that you're getting the most out of it. And also, I have a video on subject detection, how to get the most out of it, not just for Nikon, but for whatever camera you're using. There is a lot to subject detection, and that video goes a long way in kind of helping you get the most from it. So make sure you check that one out too. As always, thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.